Hi everyone, it's Penny Robinson from Monash University and I am going to show you how to do a chi-squared analysis using Graph Pad Prism version 6. Chi-squared uses contingency tables or 2x2 tables. So I click on contingency and I'm going to start with a new empty data table because I already have some data. And then I click create. The data that I'm going to enter is table 7.1, looking at vaccine versus influenza, showing the results of an influenza trial. So vaccine and placebo go in the rows, and in the columns go influenza and no influenza. And then I enter in the observed numbers, which were 80 and 220 for the vaccine group, and 80 and 140 for the no influenza group. And I also like giving the data table a name that makes sense because that allows you to track data across many things. The first thing we need to do is get the percentages. So I'll go analyze, and I want to do a parts of whole analysis, and I want to do a fraction of the total. So I say OK. When doing the fraction of the total, we want to display the results as percentages. But you can see that there's three options: divide each value by its column total, row total, or grand total. So we need to think, what percentage overall are we most interested in? Are we interested in the percentage of influenza overall, and influenza in the vaccine group and influenza in the placebo group? Or are we interested in the percentage of people who had the vaccine overall, and then the percentage of people who are vaccinated in the influenza group, and the percentage of people who are vaccinated in the no influenza group? I'd say that we actually want the percentage of people who had influenza. So we're wanting to compare influenza divided by total. So in this case, we're wanting to do row totals. So I click OK. So these are the results of total of fraction of total. Let's go back to the original data. We've got 240 people in the vaccine group, and 20 of those developed influenza. That's the percentage we want, 20 divided by 240. And that percentage of 8.3 makes sense. If I click on results, fraction of total by table 17.1, if I want to graph this, I go insert, new graph of existing data, and I want to graph the fraction of total of table 17.1. And the type of graph I want is contingency, and the first graph interleaves bars is what I want. So I say OK, and you can see that this graph is showing the percentage of people in each category. So 8.3% of people who were vaccinated got influenza, and the rate of influenza in the placebo group was 36%. So that's the percentages that we make sense. Now, if we go back and have a look at this table and choose the same type of graph, you'll see that these numbers are just the raw numbers of people who had the vaccine and had influenza or not. But because there's a different number of people who had the vaccine and placebo, this graph doesn't make sense. So it's best to look at the fraction of total. You would need to give this a better title and a more specific Y title and X title. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to leave this graph as is. So having done the graph, I'm now going to do a chi-squared analysis. So I click on Analyze. I click on chi-squared test and I say OK. The p-value calculation we want is chi-squared. We want two-tailed and we want a 95% confidence interval. Notice that you can actually do additional calculations. Specifically, you could calculate the odds ratio or the relative risk as well. In this particular example, we are not going to. So I'll click OK. So here's the analysis. You can see the data that has been analysed. You can see that the chi-squared is 53.01, the degrees of freedom is 1, and the p-value is less than 0.0001. So yes, it is statistically significant. This is very similar to the chi-squared value that was obtained in the textbook. You'll see here that there's a yellow box saying consider using Fisher's test instead of chi-squared. But we have got a large sample, so we can do a chi-squared. So that is how you use Graph Pad Prism to do a chi-squared test. Notice how I was entering the data from the textbook. What happens if you've got raw data? The answer is that Graph Pad Prism actually doesn't allow you to summarize raw data into a contingency table first. So if we were wanting to categorize the data into a table, we'd have to do that by using another software package like Microsoft Excel first. So now I'll show you how to do that. Okay, now I have got Microsoft Excel open, and the dataset I've got open is the Peru lung respiratory symptoms dataset, which is available from the Essential Medical Statistics website or is available on Moodle for BMS 1042 students. There are a few variables: ID number, the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, age in years, height in centimetres, sex, and respiratory symptoms. So I want to categorise sex and respiratory symptoms into a table. So what I need to do is I need to click on Insert and then click on Pivot Table. I'm going to select all of the data and I'm going to say that I want the pivot table on a new worksheet because that's easier. Then I say OK. Respiratory symptoms is the outcome, so I'm going to drag respiratory symptoms into the columns. And sex is the exposure, so I'm dragging that into the column labels. What I'm going to do now is drag ID into the sum of values and go value field settings and change that to count. That shows the number of people who experienced and did not experience respiratory symptoms and whose gender was coded 0 and 1. I have just looked up the coding. Female was coded 0 and male was coded 1. No respiratory symptoms was coded 0 and yes respiratory symptoms was coded 1. Now, if I want to do an analysis using this data, I copy the information and then go back to GraphPad. With the information on the clipboard, I go to New Data Table and Graph. I want a contingency table with an empty data set again, and then I click Paste. Except we actually want yes respiratory symptoms to be before no respiratory symptoms. So I'll just move that back. And again, I've given the data a sensible title. Now we can proceed to do the same things again. I'll do a chi-squared first this time. I want chi-squared. Okay. So in this case, you can see that the chi-squared is 0.7663 with 1 degrees of freedom, and the p-value is 0.3814. So it is not statistically significant. Let's see what this looks like in a graph. Back to parts of whole analysis. And again, we want the row total because we're interested in respiratory symptoms in the two groups, and we want percentages. And then having got that, we do a graph of existing data, and we want a contingency graph. So this contingency graph shows that the percentage of respiratory symptoms in the females and the males is pretty similar, and the percentage of no respiratory symptoms between females and males is also pretty similar. So the graph matches the analysis that we got in the chi-squared analysis. One more thing to show you. If we go back to a table, just say that you had a table with multiple categories and multiple exposures and multiple outcomes. And after doing the chi-squared analysis, you needed to collapse some of this information. If you right-click on the data table, you can say duplicate the current sheet, and then you can do the collapsing in a new table without altering the old one. I hope that you found this video about using chi-squared analysis in Graph Pad Prism useful.